I'm really very happy and grateful to Rolf. Thanks a lot for organizing all that. To give my modest contribution to this high-level symposium. And my intention is to talk on the usefulness of integrated land use and transport models. We already had the nice citation yesterday of George Box to say essentially all models are wrong, and basically they are wrong because they are not the reality. But some of them are useful, so that's my hope, that's my wish, that all of us, and more specifically Rolf, will contribute to this endeavor to make these models useful. So yeah, here's my ideas about it. Is there a flip beamer? Okay. So I brought some color pictures. Great, they are in color. This is from our accessibility instrument. And we have shown this map in a meeting of the redevelopment of the ancient, military airfield of Fürstenfeldbruck. And the chief urban planner of the city of Fürstenfeldbruck, he spontaneously came out with that sentence to say, oh wow, if I see these maps, I get inspired to develop new ideas about planning and about the question of accessibility of these different locations. This is a very basic public transport indicator showing the frequency, the travel time, the necessity to change connections within the region of Munich. And it shows up that this redevelopment area has a very poor accessibility today. So from this, new ideas came up to say, well, we need to connect this with a tangential bus rapid transit. Perhaps we can even calm our neighbors because they are on the S-Bahn line, but they don't have a station. Why don't we put a station here? They will be more happy than before. So this kind of very simple maps showed to be useful in the sense of being an inspiration for stimulating new solutions. And we are in an, I would say, urgent need of even better and more complete integrated land use and transport models, because another example from the region, urban growth is taking place. It's taking place at transport nodes. This is a 60-hectare activity zone somewhere at a motorway junction in the urban region of Munich. And it's just the first stage. It's a small local municipality. They have set up a land use plan to say, why shouldn't we have this activity zone here? The neighboring community will do the same. So basically an edge city might grow there over the next decades. And nobody asked for the traffic impacts so far. And on the other hand, we are doing major investments into the transportation infrastructure. Just last week, the political decision was taken on financing a second S-Bahn tunnel section in the inner city of Munich. Interestingly enough, the city itself didn't take part in that decision. It's a decision of the Free State of Bavaria and the national government. And we are not exactly sure about the benefit to cost ratio that has been calculated in the German standard assessment for this transit investments. But we are sure that the land use changes that will be generated by this major infrastructure, not so much in the inner city area, but on the large regional scale, because there's new residential areas getting much more attractive with express services now than they have used to be before. These changes, these expected changes in the urban structure are not considered in the public transport infrastructure assessment. So I think we need such models to better estimate and predict potential changes in the land use and in the transport sector, and also to assess these changes ahead of the major decisions. So we need such models. What kind of models do we have? I've brought the probably most simple and also a very old model of land use and transport interactions. I like it very much. It's Egyptian. It says this is a city, and it perfectly shows that there is a link between the transportation. Oh, this doesn't work on the screen. Between the transportation supply, between a crossroad, between a transport node, a hub, and the urban environment, and vice versa. Yeah? It's more than 5,000 years old, and in this shape, it also shows that this is there's a dynamics behind. It's not an equilibrium. Yeah? It's printed in the book of Benevolo on the history of cities, but it's wrongly printed. It's printed like the Christian cross to be stable, but the city is not. The city is moving, the city is changing. In Munich, with 1.5 million inhabitants, we have 200,000 moves every year. So the city is moving, the city is changing quite fast. And well, I developed this model a little further based on the feedback cycle of Michael Wegener as well, to be a system model, to be a system thinking model, potentially a system dynamics model that I also detailed in my PhD, because I think this might help to communicate about these interactions and to make the decision makers aware about the impacts of their decisions. I will not go into the detail of the various feedback mechanisms here, but I would rather like to strengthen that accessibility seems to be a key variable in that system, an active driver of change, but something that cannot be addressed directly, but can be addressed by planning, either in transportation or in land use. And that's the ambition to say, why do we do that? Because we want to provide sustainable accessibility. We want to improve the conditions of urban but also regional mobility, and to provide more livable places by a coordination of transport supply measures, land use measures, and then mobility management measures. We have set up at TUM a tool for this, where we follow the idea of a multi-layer approach, a so-called accessibility atlas that is still under construction, and new pages are added, so to say, to this book on many scales. We have a nice map that is not on the screen that now will also go to the Bavarian school books in geography, so perhaps that might help to introduce young people into our topics. We have set up accessibility measures like ISO cost functions on mobility costs as well, and we are now going to introduce CO2 as a constraint, as a boundary condition to the catchment areas in order to provide spatial analysis on what climate mitigation might mean in terms of local conditions. And we also will deepen the aspect of walkability, of walking conditions, of access to like local public transport stops, for example. Why accessibility? I don't need to train you in this here, but I want to highlight that this compound indicator is integrating the land use component and the transport component. And perhaps we need to put even more emphasis in the description and explanation of our models into the definition of the attractiveness of a place, perhaps the number of jobs, the number of residents as an indicator for the opportunities at destination is not enough to really describe the urban quality. And on the other hand, we are quite well in our models estimating and calculating travel time. I think we need to improve in travel costs and in comfort. Comfort variable is much more diverse and perhaps much more important in order to describe the real behavior behind. So with this very rough background, we have set up accessibility tools and analysis and instruments, and we have tested them in practice. So I basically refer to a cost action that has also a very nice website if you want to learn more about the other European partners, where we have introduced these kind of accessibility instruments into a setting with different stakeholders. So here around the table you have urban planners, transport planners from the city, from the region, public transport and other means of transportation. And we introduce these accessibility analysis into a planning scenario. And the planning question was something that is at urge in the Munich region because the region is growing. And the question was, where should we locate these new residents that are expected in the Munich region? And interestingly enough, a very simple map turned out to be the most powerful tool for the discussion. That was just the accessibility to jobs by public transport. Yeah? And this is to say that even very simple maps can contribute to that discussion. We brought also 3 different scenarios that we had prepared in advance to show the different settings. And that puts another question also to the modeling instruments, I think. That is the question of being interactive. So we have been discussing yesterday about the question of computing times, if it's 25 minutes or 3 days. I think if we can make it to have an interactive dialogue within the workshops, that would be even more powerful. And potentially this is possible with these accessibility indicators because you can easily edit the network and the structural properties at hand. So some intermediate conclusions of this lessons learned on the instruments and on the models. I think these models, more than being just academic and, let's say, scientific instruments to go deeper and deeper in the detail, it's platforms of communication where people can adhere and can share their ideas and can contribute to a mutual understanding of the different partners, of different disciplinary backgrounds, and perhaps also different interests of the stakeholders. And in order to do that, these tools should act as a platform where those people can connect to. And in order to make this happen, the tools need to be easy to understand. Yeah? Or, I will show that at the last slide, you need somebody to translate the findings of the model, and you need a facilitator or somebody acting between the practice partners and the tool itself. It should be comprehensive, and more specifically, it has to be sensitive to the questions. I feel very bad if our models give constraints themselves. Yeah? So to say, well, we cannot handle this question because it's not in the model, then I think the model is not appropriate. And we had this discussion briefly yesterday. It helps if the results are visually appealing so that people can take this as a base of discussion. I already touched the point that those tools should be interactive and they should be implemented in a, well, it's perhaps not perfectly written here, in a setting where people can interact. Frederick Fester, with whom I have worked in the beginning of my PhD, he said it's useless to build a model for a client, but you need to model with the client so that the client can understand what is in the model and have an idea about the impacts of their decisions. So in a best case scenario, this might lead to a common language, to better understanding, to shared perspectives, and then last but not least, to better outcome in the planning itself, because that is what I think the success of our tools should be measured on. So in addition to that, some very brief practice experience on implementing a specific accessibility indicator in the region. That's the so-called LUPTI index, some of you might know, developed in Australia by Griffith University colleagues. And it's a very, very simple thing to merge existing urban densities and urban quality on one scale, and the accessibility, I think it's on public transport to other opportunities on another scale. And it shows on this GIS-based raster grid very pragmatic orientations for planning. The first would be these areas where the density is rather low, but the service quality is rather high. Those places could be used for urban regeneration projects, for higher density, higher diversity, just around this railway hub, for example, that has perhaps a very poor urban development in the surrounding. And on the other hand, there might be areas that have quite a potential in population or also in jobs or other density indicators, but a rather bad public transport situation. And this should just highlight the need for improving the public transport system. So very simple conclusions, but very powerful in the communication. That's what we adopted in the Munich region within a practice project on climate mitigation. We were asked to develop ideas to improve the transport and land use concepts for the county of Fürstenfeldbruck. So this is exactly the same map that you have seen before on public transport quality. Basically, it's the access to all the other public transportation nodes in the Munich region. We have the residential density, and we have the overlay of the two, and the very simplistic analysis would be to say the blue areas have a very powerful public transport accessibility, but could be improved in terms of urban structure. So concentrate urban growth here if possible. Obviously, that needs to be looked at in detail then for other constraints. And the other hand, well, difficult perhaps to discuss, but the red areas have a relatively bad public transportation service. So are we able to improve the public transport services here in a low density, sprawling region or not? The interesting fact is that the president of the county of Fürstenfeldbruck has used exactly this map in a regional conference on housing policies, and he tried to explain what we have delivered in terms of analysis. He didn't completely achieve, but it was interesting to see that the outcome of this analysis was used in the policy arena. So some conclusions on this concerning the process. So we are successful, I think, in the implementation of the tools into being useful contributions for the development if, well, going through this list, not just us, the experts are able to understand and translate what we see, but also stakeholders and decision makers refer to it. Professionals are forced to use it. So the county of Fürstenfeldbruck now, for example, has set up a structural development plan for their local municipalities, and the consultancy was explicitly asked to refer to these analyses to be incorporated in the policy making. and then hopefully it will contribute to the real change. We will develop this further in our context and setting. And I just mentioned this morning to Eric Miller, TUM is evolving. We have not just integrated Rolf Möckel in our group, but also Costas Antonio. And perhaps as interesting, TUM School of Governance will try to link the engineering perspective, the technical perspective, the technological innovations with the policy making, with the decision-making processes. And there might be very interesting further inter- and transdisciplinary cooperation. So to conclude, I think it's not enough just to build the models, but we should ask ourselves what can these models contribute to. And the accessibility instruments I've shown, and I hope also more complicated and complex and more complete land use and transport interaction models should be able and can contribute to generate creative solutions, so to really inspire the planning aspect. They can and should contribute to facilitate the translation between land use and transport, because still there's two very distinct and separate sectors and paradigms and also funding schemes. They should be appropriate to the task. That's something I really want to come back to, because the model quality is depending on the purpose. They should involve the stakeholders and then contribute to planning and decision making, as they are supposed to be planning support systems. So if they don't support the planning, what is the use case about? So there is an impact on governance, and yet another system thinking model on how this governance take place, and where perhaps models will then come in to this development of the reality. Strategies are implemented if there is a political will behind, if citizens and if the public is agreeing on that. That can be a reinforcing feedback mechanism, and as well the local industry, the local economy, the private stakeholders, the private sector will contribute to the development in real life, so that should be considered if it's about the implementation. And last but not least, Rolf, you might remember the bar. We had a coffee, yeah, just next door to his offices. And that's the story about the coffee machine and the question how to really implement these models. If you have taken the coffee this morning in the breakfast room, that was a very simple model. Yeah? Just have to press one button and there is good coffee coming out of it. Yeah? And that's part of the learning from our cost action in accessibility instruments. If we develop the models to be scientifically sound, complete, and to be able to answer all the questions, they are getting more and more complex and complicated. And if we really want these models to be used, they will get more simple again. Yeah? And if there is a gap between what is expected in the real-life planning practice and available on the scientific domain, what we then need is a good barista. It's not just the name of the coffee machine, yeah, but it's somebody who is able to do the translation between the needs of planning practice and the scientific perspective, and I hope we will continue to do that job. And yeah, that's my wish, to make these models work and to make them successful in their implementation. So I'm looking very much forward to the next coffee we have and to the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gebhard. That takes our discussion to the next level. How do we use our models? How do we apply our models? And yeah, I'm opening the discussion here for comments.
Thank you. So I wholeheartedly agree that we need to make our models more useful, and not just the land use models, the transport models as well. And I find sometimes that accessibility measures are not as insightful as one would hope they would be, because we're, I don't know if lazy is the right word, but the land use, the way in which we characterize land use and transport cost is sometimes kind of naive in that we use jobs, and a job is a job, right? And we don't, and it's a big deal when we split between retail and other types of jobs. And similarly for transport, we use cost and travel time, but it's not the same traveling, walking 10 minutes on a nice street versus walking 10 minutes on a crime-ridden neighborhood. And so how do we, have you been more successful at coming up with more relevant ways, I would say, of characterizing both land use and transport when building accessibility measures?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, we are also still very naive at that level. Yeah? We are trying to integrate costs, as I mentioned, and then also congestion levels, and we try to incorporate for the walkability, the perception of people that take the walk, for example, to the public transport stop. And I imagine we could develop something like a level of service for this quality description, and then give it a weight in the distance reported in the accessibility measurement. But there's another point that is an obvious criticism not to hide, that these accessibility indicators, they are just showing a potential. Yeah? But I like the idea that this is showing the potential, because that might then contribute to the reflection on planning. So what could we change, and how then these potentials would look like? What we are basically not able to do with these kind of indicators is to predict the behavior. So that is another story, and then this is the more complex behavioral analysis in the demand modeling.
Yeah, my question is mostly about how to transport this. I mean, the outward-facing interface from what you do still seems to be a book. Is this the long-term, I mean, if the accessibility atlas is something that's a PDF, is this the way to go, or are you thinking about other ways to transport this?
Of course not. So I think it's a book with many pages, but basically it's a GIS platform. So we do individualized analysis with it depending on the planning question. We also had a web interface set up to have it an interactive tool on the internet. This is something that could be very interesting to deepen. And as I mentioned, my wish would be to make it more interactive so that we can bring the computer. That was one of the conclusions out of the workshop, and the research associate said, why didn't we bring the computer and just try to turn it on and calculate the new indicators in the coffee break? And I think that's the way to go.
Yes, well, because you would expect that. I fully agree that it is important to model with the client, and usually the clients, including the government and the general public, only have very limited understanding of maps and analysis.
Yes.
The common saying in England is that the broadsheet newspapers are written really for people with a mental age of 9 in the UK, and the Financial Times is written for people with a mental age of 12. So
Well.
the significance of that is that, of course, I said at the beginning that modelers are all essentially the same kind of people who actually are very sophisticated in understanding of media, of data. But the current political movements or the political trend is that people actually who have a very little understanding of the actual analysis could actually influence the big decisions, right? So actually here it is important. Now, I'm more interested, there's a question for you, of the kind of narratives that you have already developed, of actually how you work with public and using these maps, actually. So it would be quite good, actually, to perhaps bring out this kind of stories, actually, how maps actually influence decisions and so on. So in a way, it's very similar to what Kai just asked, where it's really to do with in practical settings, what lessons been learned and so on, right? So
yeah, of course. I mean, that's a difficult question. I wouldn't say that all politicians are dumb, but you need to translate the discussion. Yeah. So what we basically did also in this workshop setting was to come in a first session to say, okay, that's what we think about, that's what the tool can provide. What's your questions? And we really did a workshop on the planning questions, and then focused this down to say, okay, the question is about residential housing and location of those housing. And then we went back home and translated that into indicators in the model and came back for another session to show the results and some scenarios on it. Yeah? So that went out quite nicely, even though then in the second session some planners had difficulties to understand the maps. I agree. Yeah? But on the other hand, we just had recently a very nice cooperation with the county of Munich. And here the president of the county, he quickly understood that this is a new approach to planning, because they want to invest in public transportation services. And from a classical perspective, these investments cannot be justified. Yeah? So we have been discussing, Kai Nagel and me, in the bus, yeah? What about these classical standard assessment procedures of public transportation, yeah? They take into account a given situation. They don't have the variation on urban structure and basically on origin-destination flows in a future scenario. So that was something he quickly grasped, and he completely stick to this Luptai index. And quickly understood the power of these ideas. So I think it depends on the people you talk to. Sometimes my impression is that the general public or then people you involve in workshop with citizens' involvement are much more ready to experiment than the political decision-making councils. Yeah? So that's another policy question I rather ask to you, perhaps for your experience. Yeah? How to make these decision-making forums, yeah, of municipal councils and all the kind of scales around more creative and perhaps more ready to experiment and to try out things rather than just to try to calm everybody's interests.
Just on the experience of working with citizens, I think I was telling David yesterday that in Newcastle, where I live,
Yeah.
there was a proposal for a new transport corridor, road corridor across the north of the city, and modelling was done, traffic forecasts were put in, and new housing developments were put into the whole process, and the calculations of the traffic volumes came up to the point that the only way to solve the congestion at a particular junction was to hugely increase the size of this interchange, which meant building a massive, essentially a motorway interchange on this area of green space, which is about 500 meters from where I live. And there was huge local opposition to this, and nobody wanted this interchange. Nobody understood where it had come from. And so the council, to their credit, stepped back from that process, said, we're not going to build that. And what we want to do is set up a working group with local people and residents groups and disability representatives. And so there's 13 different organizations on this working group, and I'm representing the kind of, well, I'm on the public transport user group, but also other things. So we go and sit in this room every 2 weeks together and discuss what this might mean. And these are local people who don't know about transport modelling, but the council are being made to bring their projections along and explain how their models work to come up with these forecasts of traffic volumes. And local people are interested, and I keep saying, go away next week, bring back these figures and explain, give us a video of how this model works. And we've got to the point that instead of talking about this kind of predict and provide, the traffic volume will be this, therefore we need this junction, we've gone right back to first principles, and it's like, what can we do instead? Why are these houses being built in those locations? Why aren't there better public transport services to those houses? And it's a discussion involving the city about these policies that nobody's been interested in before, nobody's been involved in before. So I think, from my personal experience, it can work and we can get people interested, but it's a real challenge for the transport planners in the city to actually step away from their computers almost and go and talk to citizens. And you can see them struggling sometimes, but I think it's a very interesting development. So I fully support your statements.
Thanks a lot.
Sorry, Darren.
I cheekily have two questions. So one is a follow-up to the point that Rosario was making, and that's a simple one. So in calculating travel costs, can we be a little bit more sophisticated and take into consideration the utility of the journey, in the sense that, if you're sitting on a train, then you can actually use that time in a highly productive way, whereas sitting in a car, it's basically dead time. If I'm cycling, then I've got a significant indirect benefit for my health. And that has...
But perhaps a disutility if it's raining.
Sorry?
But perhaps a disutility if it's raining.
I'm an all-weather cyclist. I don't mind. It's a function of the clothing that you wear. But this is a serious point, because health costs are very significant for the economy. So I'm just kind of wondering whether we can be more sophisticated in our calculations. The other is, it's about your criteria for the usefulness of a common platform, and I completely agree on that making our tools interactive is, to some extent, the holy grail. But isn't there also a sort of a tension there in terms of the scope of our models and the complexity of them, so that if we have relatively large numbers of parameters, and of course it takes time to define a new scenario, to then perform a simulation so that we've got results back in a timely way. I'm just kind of wondering how far where you feel we are in making tools really interactive, and are there limitations in terms of the scope of tools that could truly become interactive?
So perhaps on the second point, I think we are far from being there. I think we can get there with simple models, and I've also had a nice exchange with other colleagues in that cost action, but also in other fields on the accessibility planning questions. I think there it's possible, and it's also something that people request in the workshop, so I think that's something we should really work on. I'm not sure, because I'm not the expert in the large-scale demand modeling platforms, how realistic it is. But you also have from the Netherlands tools that are online that at least give some very simple first results, and then if you want to go deeper, you need to call the consultancy to to pass the contract. Yeah? And the first question was again, just sorry.
It was just about whether we can make our estimates of travel costs a little bit more refined.
Yeah, of course we can. I mean, that's something that needs to be discussed also with the other colleagues, how far we can go and how far it's reasonable to go in terms of calibration then perhaps to all these additional parameters. But I think if we just stick to travel time, it's too short. It's not the key decision criteria of people. There's other criteria.
Thank you. I think there's a comment, or cluster of comments, rather than perhaps a question, but if I may, picking up on what Alistair and Darren have both been saying, and I also have reservations about how feasible, or even perhaps how desirable it is to get to a point of models that are run in the course of meetings. I think there's a lot to be said for the kind of weekly or fortnightly or maybe twice a week cycle that has been mentioned, simply because of the time that is needed and the care that is needed to set up models, not just to run them, which is that's the bit that's done by the machines, and can be, but also to check and to interpret the results, and for a facilitator, as you say, to be able to explain things well. She or he needs the time to prepare and to understand precisely what the models are saying, especially because simple models don't always suffice. And certainly in the areas where we're working on the frontiers of land use and economic modelling, the extra complexity of some of the economics is essential to the discussion. I think the other thing I wanted to comment on is there's at least another way into the use of modelling. I think the kind of workshops and discussions that you have been describing sound in many respects very open-ended, with the option to consider what public transport investment or what land use interventions may be best. But a lot of work, in my experience, as a consultant, arises from the need to provide more detailed analysis of specific proposals or of a small range of proposals to address a specific problem. And I think in terms of developing interest and confidence in land use transport models generally, showing that we can contribute to the discussion on specific proposals, whether it is S-Bahns or major motorway intersections on public open space in Newcastle, that is an important way in. And finally, just want to emphasize something that you've mentioned, perhaps, but I'm sure you didn't have time to go into, and that is the distinction between forecasting the impacts of a particular intervention and assessing the benefits of it. You pointed out that conventional public transport appraisal doesn't pick up on, most cases completely excludes land use impacts or excludes the possibility of complementary land use planning interventions. That is a problem that's been recognized for a long time and is one where we've been making progress in the UK over the last few years with methods that provide an alternative method or alternative methods, plural, of assessing benefits, either in conventional economic terms or in conventional welfare terms that do recognize the land use consequences and that can deal with land use and transport policies in combination. So that may be of interest to follow up later.
Yeah. Well, nice to hear the last point, very good. For the first one, on interactive models within one session, of course, that will not always be possible. But I think the attitude of the modeler to say, okay, I'm sensitive to the questions and I try to adopt what I can provide with the model, if not within the session, then of course, I mean, there will be a sequence of sessions, you know, from one session to the next or to the session after that, would be very helpful.
Great. Alistair?
One of the things we've tried in the past with different kinds of models, with water and land use models, is running the models in advance and producing the outputs and then putting them into an interface where you have maybe some little sliders with 2 dimensions of change. So you might want to make your public transport, you know, more or less frequent, or you might want to make your land use more or less dense. Yeah. And then you've got the model runs with the complexity and the knowledge behind them. But when you present them to people, you can just let them move things up and down and simplify the description a bit more. And they're just looking at different images. And it is interactive in a way, but they're not having to go away and run the entire model and check the results and do all that. That's been done in advance. So maybe that's a way of giving you that interactivity without sacrificing the functionality of the model.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Gebhard, for this
you.
input.
Yeah.